one of the things that people wanted to hear about, our premium subscribers, was the geopolitical realignment. And I think that in terms of the top line stories that are coming out of it, we've talked on the show about NATO expansion, but I think the more interesting meta point is, what does the balance of power in the world look like right now? So previous to this, we would have said, previous to the Russian invasion, Russia, number 11th largest GDP in the world, literally less than Italy. America is moving away from this. The European Union plays a central role in terms of our cultural ties, but let's all be honest, that's not really where America's focus on. It was all China all the time. In terms of our discussion right now, it feels very much like it's 1972. Like we're talking, it's all Russia, it's all NATO, it's all détente or rollback. We have to decide on like how we're going to confront this, and yet at the same time, we have India, the largest democracy in the world, not joining with us in terms of their sanctions, not really joining the Western Bloc. We're still focused on NATO expansion. China, in the China lockdown, as we're seeing in real time, massive impact on our economy, on our supply chain in a way that didn't exist at all. So I feel like we're living in this parallel world where our foreign policy media attention and focus is living in one year, and then on the same time, our actual interests are fading away with an almost on autopilot without any of the sort of debate and things that we need in order to avoid a possible conflagration in the future. Go ahead, Mark.
I want to push back on your frame.
Sure.
So I did an episode of Bridge Colby on this. Yep. So, you know, a friend of the show, obviously, and I don't want to claim we can do everything all at once. But we can recognize that what happens in one theater affects another theater. So, for example, this just happened yesterday, and they're like reporting this is a little inconclusive, so I don't want to overstate, but the flagship of Russia's Black Sea fleet was just at a minimum, it probably wasn't sunk, but at a minimum, it was taken out of the fight.
So the fire's been out.
Yeah, the fire, but it's been effectively taken out of the fight by a
it's a Neptune missile.
By a Ukrainian-built like surface to water missile. Not the technical term, obviously. Here's why this matters for the China issue. This is the definition of something that makes the Chinese, when they're thinking about a Taiwanese invasion that would involve like an amphibious actual aspect, is actually deeply important. Because the number one takeaway from the Ukrainian conflict, now this, and by the way, I'm like a moderate interventionist, I need to be very clear. So no-fly zone, I didn't support the MiGs, no NATO boots on the ground, all those different bits. But China is seeing so much of the past 2 months, and the very clear implication is, wow, like invading another country in the year 2022 is a shit show. And there's been very good reporting that this is almost certainly affecting how the Chinese are thinking about this. So I want to agree with you that, and once again, there are people on my side who probably talk this way and they say like, haha, all these people say that we're going to pivot to Asia. They're stupid. The future is in Europe. The future is not in Europe, but what happens in Europe affects Asia, and that should drive how we think about this.
Sure.
Like that should, so for example, what debate should we be having right now? From my perspective, the debate should be, hey, if you're in the Taiwanese government right now, how are you getting the equivalent of Neptune missiles to make sure that your country is kept safe so that the Chinese do not invade in the first place and you have actual deterrence?
I think that's a good point. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, honestly, if China wants to take Taiwan, they either do it and just get away with it, or it's a similar situation to what we're seeing now in Ukraine, where they're just bogged down in an extended fight. That's all. But in terms of like, what can the U.S. actually do about it? Well, I mean, we're learning now with what's happening in Ukraine. Like, when you're talking about Afghanistan, when you're talking about Iraq, when you're talking about countries that we could basically bully into submission, like, yeah, then we go to war. But when it's a kind of like Vladimir Putin has more nukes than we do, so we can't do anything except, arms on the ground or whatever. And so I think that's the reality of the situation, in my opinion. But to your question about basically unipolar world versus multipolar world, I think there's no doubt that it's really the unipolar world. The U.S. is the world's sole superpower. That's definitely going away. And what you're seeing now is Russia is reliant on China in order to really just function. Right. Yeah, I mean, we had when we put those SWIFT banking sanctions, then China immediately welcomed them into whatever their equivalent for banking is. Yep. And what you're seeing also with the Belt and Road Initiative is basically China is doing empire through, in my in my opinion, a more evolved means. That doesn't mean it's good. It just means it's a slightly more evolved version of imperialism, because what we do is, we have basically puppet dictators that are in countries that allow then our corporations to exploit the natural resources in those countries. And that was an evolution from like the British way of doing it, which was like they just show up in India and they're like, this is ours now. And so, but what China's doing is a step further. Hey, what if we gave you some material well-being through building out infrastructure in your countries, and then you allow us to exploit you in return? And so, yeah, I think that if the long-term trajectory, the sun is setting on the American empire. It's eventually going to be probably, a Chinese empire, and then they'll rise and fall too, just like every single empire. But it is very strange to live in as tumultuous a time as we do right now, because, you're actually seeing a rapid decline of the American empire, in my opinion.
But why? Like, if you think about
why
it,
what?
Like, so let's define, like, once again, like, American empire is we'll have different definitions of that, but like, NATO's stronger than ever.
They're not going to do shit, though.
No, well, they're not supposed to do shit. They're
and I agree, right?
But this is the point, though. Like, the American empire wasn't in Ukraine in the set beyond like supplying weapons, and we're doing that now. Like, NATO as an institution is now safe. And there was serious about whether or not NATO as an institution would sunset. NATO is almost certainly going to expand into Finland and Sweden. The U.S.'s actual perception in Western Europe is the highest it's been in a long, long, long time. If you're a European right now, you are not thinking about what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, as terrible as those things were. You're thinking, wow, I'm glad that there are U.S. troops there. Like, our relations with Poland were like going like this. Now they're back up like that.
So you don't think the American empire is in decline? Is that the point?
But what you call American empire, I call like a U.S. led world order. Blah 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 blah. Like, there's like, we could like quibble with like the specific ways we call it, but like, what I would define as the status quo is the U.S. has allied countries who we support militarily, fiscally, whatever. Like, we're gonna get even deeper in with Japan. We're deeper in with South Korea. We're deeper in with Europe. Like,
but on the other side, they're more united too. Would you concede that now China, Russia, Iran? We could go down a list here. Even India now is sort of wobbling and going more.
India pursued nukes in the 80s and 90s. Like, we had sanctions. Like, I did a good up. India's always doing whatever. India
non-alignment is
I'm sorry.
Go
well,
ahead.
I was just going to say, I think there is a clear hardening of it is almost like a new Iron Curtain. And,
right.
So there's a few things to say about this. So first of all, our financial economic warfare against Russia, which it has gone so far that it definitely is that, it definitely having an impact on the Russian economy, creating great suffering for the Russian people, no doubt about that. But it also has strengthened those alternative systems and strengthened the motivations for China and even Saudi and other countries to say, we got to make sure that we're never going to be in a position to really be destroyed by American sanctions. So there's that part of it. But I think if we zoom out, one other thing to say about that, it actually reminds me of these sort of like increasingly difficult loyalty tests from Trump, where it's like the more outrageous and obnoxious he is, he's able to see who's really with him. And that's kind of what Russia has done with China, right? Like, they basically have created this test for China of like, all right, are we really in this together? And effectively, China has said, we don't love what's going on. We're not going to like directly back you, but basically, yes. So that is part of what has created that hardened Iron Curtain being drawn sense of the world, and then the media censorship and all of that plays into it. Part of why I view American influence and empire as being in decline is because the ideology behind it has basically been exposed as morally bankrupt and wrong. So the McDonald's in every square theory that if we just get, free markets into Russia, then we're all going to be friends and democracy is going to follow and peace is going to reign supreme. Well, that was a fucking fantasy. So that ideology has been thoroughly indicted. Then you add on top of that our blatant hypocrisies and own routine violations of the supposed international rule of law that we supposedly care about and architect. And you add on top of that, the mass populist uprisings that we've seen around the globe that have continued, that have challenged the neoliberal economic status quo, which is part and parcel with this foreign policy worldview. Yeah, the American neoliberal, like, shock doctrine and we're going to have democracy around the world and we're going to install it. All of that has been thoroughly dismantled as an ideology. So that's why I think the American influence and empire is in decline.
And even just Trump and Biden getting elected, these people they're like symbols of a decaying society.
Yes.
To have any situation where Donald Trump wins the presidential election and then Joe Biden, who's half dead, wins the presidential election as a backlash from Trump, that's not a healthy society. That's a society that's in severe decline.
Quick response.
Yeah, so the quick response is, A, like Richard Nixon literally like committed severe crimes at Watergate as the Vietnam War ended in defeat. So I don't think we should read into bad leadership at the top here. But what I would just say, Chris, was I actually don't disagree with your, like, we're dunking on
the
Thomas.
meta.
Let's say his name. Like, we're attacking Thomas Friedman. Like, when we talk about, like, two countries with the McDonald's have never gone, like, we were wrong, totally wrong.
Yeah.
But my underlying point is I agree with you, but what I am countering is that dynamic will only make what you call American empire. U.S. troop presences overseas, U.S. like funding of militaries, et cetera, that is only going to get stronger. Japan is now openly saying we could see a world where we have American nukes in our country. Right. That is what I think you would call an example of like American empire. That we now have a world where the polls are saying, good, more American troops. If Joe Biden called up the presidents of the Baltic countries and said, hey, we'll give you 500,000 troops, they would be dancing in the streets right now. That is what I mean by American, so correct, because we're debating a couple of things. American influence, yes, down, but that's been on a downward trajectory since the Cold War ended.
See, it's actually interesting because what you're just highlighting is that unipolarism made it so that having to pick the sides and increasing tension was supposed to go down. That was the promise of McDonald's. Now we're actually back in a system of a duality and a challenge of world, which increases tension and increases the likelihood of war. I mean, I agree with you. Sweden and Finland are probably going to be in NATO. I think that's fucking crazy, and we should not do it. That being said, the current trajectory looks like we almost certainly are, which is going to make it so that the tension does increase. My fear is that we get bogged down in some bullshit war in Europe defending Finland or Swedish territorial integrity while the entire world's GDP and future is being led in Asia. And I
Why
do not
call
think
it, like, honestly, like, real talk, like, a war that got so big that it involved Finland and Sweden isn't bullshit.
No, I disagree with that. I mean, first of all, we didn't go to war in World War II in order to defend Finnish integrity.
So what I'm saying, define bullshit. Like,
Yeah.
What I'm really getting at is like,
Okay.
a world where that war happens is a fucking disaster.
I agree with you and look, and this is where I know I sound callous. I'm really sorry, but the integrity of the Finnish border, which has been invaded by the Russians many times throughout history, is not in the nuclear interest of the United States, which is essentially what it means in order to admit them to NATO. Same with, frankly, I also believe the Baltic states, but we've already signed that treaty.
Yeah.
It is what it is. But when I'm talking about Sweden and NATO, once again, which are very much within a traditional Russian sphere of influence, that doesn't mean that they deserve to be invaded. And if they were invaded, I would support doing exactly what we've been doing here with Ukraine. Do they deserve the nuclear guarantee and the nuclear umbrella of the U.S.? Absolutely not. And so what drives me crazy about the current debate is it's like, oh, Sweden wants to be in NATO, so it's just a de facto. Well, hold on a second. What you want is immaterial. What we want is supposed to be material. Go ahead.
Okay, but I mean, the point has to be made, though. Russia should also stop giving Finland and Sweden a reason to want to be in NATO.
Listen, of course, I don't disagree. I'm with you.
No, I'm not saying the Russians are bad. I agree with you too. I agree with you too. Yeah. If I'm being 100% honest, am I or anybody I know and love, am I going to go fight and die or risk nuclear war over fucking Kyiv or some city in Finland or Sweden? The answer is hell no. There's no way. But I just feel like the other point had to be made too.
You're not wrong.
The last thing I want to say about this, because I think it's clarifying about what we are doing in Ukraine and why I said this is hardening. It's a new Iron Curtain. It is a new sort of Cold War. It's a dividing of the world. It is, sort of bolstering American empire in the ways you're talking about, Marshall, while the ideology itself is thoroughly discredited. And it certainly is giving reason for the other side of that multipolar world to strengthen as well. Ron Klain got asked about, hey, what are you doing to create an exit ramp for Putin? And Klain being a top White House advisor, I think he's more or less running the show, chief of staff. He says, yeah, he said he gives progressives pats on the head and they fall in line. That's what he does. He says, I don't want an exit ramp for Vladimir Putin.
Yeah,
I
that's psycho.
don't think that's our concern.
That's psycho.
Our concern is punishing the Russian aggression. They're not distinguishing between Putin and the Russian people, by the way, and defending the rights of the Ukrainians to have the kind of future they deserve. And that's what our military support is enabling. So he is straight out saying,
we don't want peace.
We don't want peace.
Right.
Our goal is not peace. Our goal is to make Putin pay a price. I don't want an exit ramp. Our concern is punishing Russia. So, I mean, they're saying it right out. Like, and we've had reports of this before. Biden, I think, let the truth slip when he said we cannot have Vladimir Putin in power. He cannot remain in power. We already had aides who were leaking. Basically, the only game here is effectively regime change. They aren't in this to help Ukrainians secure a peace, which is what I want to see, and I think everybody here wants to see. They are effectively forcing that division, that new Iron Curtain, and some sort of Cold War competition. And so I think that's what, that's what their goals ultimately are.
We are rolling the dice. Some people say this is hyperbolic. I assure you it is not hyperbolic. We are playing with fire, and nuclear weapons are on the table. And I think people need to understand that and realize that. And so the instability that's created by now the fact that there's a multipolar world, the downfall of having the unipolar world was, of course, like, we wantonly violate international law on a Tuesday before breakfast. You know what I mean? Like, we can invade 73% of the world's dictatorships are backed by the United States of America. Look at what we did to the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the downsides of the unipolar world with the chief hypocrite leading it. But the downside of the multipolar world is, like, potential World War III and the nukes in the air and endless instability and armament out the wazoo on both sides. I just said the word
final
wazoo.
Because we only have 9 minutes left.
Yeah. So final word that I would say is, look, I think the exit ramp is already getting taken. The only thing that made Putin pull back his ambitions to now just focusing on the East and the Donbass and those places were the fact that he was basically militarily defeated in front of Kyiv, which happened because the West supported Ukraine. So I would say that I think the current policy is working. And I think the only way you get peace, quote unquote, is Putin is convinced that he doesn't achieve the political military objectives that he wanted to have. He thought he could take Kyiv. He can't take Kyiv. He's pulled back. That part of the conflict has de-escalated. It's going to settle into a 10-year horrible, horrible war. But we had that before. We had that for 8 years after 2014. That didn't prompt Western intervention. I think we are moving the right direction. And I just think at this point, the ball is in Putin's court. And the way that you get him to peace is Ukrainian victory on the battlefield in specific situations like the battle around Kyiv.
I think we have gone so far that there is no political will or desire even to ever lessen the sanctions that we've imposed on them, even if they were to come to some sort of negotiated settlement. So now the reality of the world is you've got another pariah state, you've got another, baddie country that any time that we can get a chance at regime change in there, we're going to be messing around, maybe not directly on the ground. And to me, that does not help to preserve world peace or stability. So it's in my view, a very dangerous landscape. Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.